Surprise. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much, Anna. And you too. Uh, Thank you so much for scheduling your beach time around this event. I'm so honored to be here. For those of you who don't know who I am, I'm Celeste Lecesne, and my pronouns are they, he, and I'm the co-founder of the Trevor Project and also the co-founder of, more recently, the Future Perfect Project, which is a nonprofit, and we amplify the creative voices of LGBTQ plus youth nationwide. Please check out what they have to say. It's amazing. And I'm also an actor, writer, and all that stuff that, artists do. Um, and I am going to introduce formally my guest, not really my guest, our guest. Chase Strangio, co-director of the ACLU's LGBTQ plus and HIV project, is a national leader in transgender rights, litigation, and advocacy. He has been counsel in pivotal legal fights, including challenges to North Carolina's HB2, Trump's trans military ban, and recent anti-trans laws in several states. Obergefell versus Hodges, marriage equality, and the Amy Stevens case. And he recently, as you probably heard, made history by becoming the first known openly transgender person to argue before the Supreme Court. Please welcome Chase Strangio. Love, love, love. I just want to start by saying something from my heart, which is I truly wish that as a little queer kid growing up in the second half of the 20th century, that there was somebody like you who stood up for me. That's why I'm here, because you are such a hero to me in terms of what you're doing in this world for those young people that we love so much. And we have that in common. And I was a little nervous about doing this whole thing because I felt it was way above my pay grade and I didn't know shit about the Supreme Court. But I found out a lot. And there was one thing that I heard on a podcast that you said, and when they asked you how you prepared for the case, and I know you probably did a lot of rehearsing and studying, but you said that you spent like a month or so just listening to Defying Gravity on your earpods. And I thought, oh, I can interview that person. Okay, okay. Um, so I'm guessing that everybody knows about the case and you know about the decision and everything. And I just want to start by asking, how are you?
Well, I am very happy to be here. I was like, you know what I need is to go to a gay town, because that is going to make this week a lot better. And I have, a history of coming here. I grew up outside Boston, and I think when I think about this week, when I think about the decision, I think about queer histories, queer legacies, and how we build together. And what better place to come than P-Town to remind myself of that as we move through this moment when so many people and so many people in our communities are under such sustained assault. And so being here is what's making me feel good in this moment. And as someone who does know a lot about the Supreme Court, I also know exactly what to expect from them in many ways. And as devastating as this decision was, and as painful as it is to see people have to continue to live under these laws, I also know that we got a decision that, disappointing as it was, allows us a lot of tools to keep fighting. And so I'm holding on to those senses of possibility.
In the decision, was there something that really surprised you, like that you went like, that's crazy.
Well, the whole decision is crazy in
Yeah.
the sense that it's like, you have to contort, as Justice Sotomayor ends up saying in the dissent, is you have to contort precedent and logic to say that banning medical care because it allows someone to live inconsistent with their sex is not about sex. And the court's precedents really don't allow for that contorted just disingenuous decision. That said, I'm very used to reading distorted, disingenuous decisions from this court. So that doesn't necessarily surprise me. I think in this moment when a lot of people are looking for some middle ground in this court and trying to find people within the nine who might be moderates, there has been a lot of talk about Justice Barrett. And I think I, even though intellectually I knew that was impossible, just knowing everything I know about her, I really also sort of bought into the idea that she might be a vote in our favor. And so she ended up writing a concurrence that is much further to the right than the majority opinion from the chief, that joins Alito and Thomas in this very extreme set of views about the Constitution's protection of trans people. So I think that was just a little bit of a wake up call. I think we'll see more from her this term, still unfortunately targeting our community, because there's another case, Mahmoud, coming down about Maryland school districts teaching of LGBT books in elementary school. So I think we'll see some nastiness from her and Alito still to come.
And does this mean that this case now, the other states, the other 24 states, cannot? They're just, it just paves the way for them to do what they're going to do. The 24 states that have banned gender affirming healthcare.
Yeah, so I mean, in a sense, what's really devastating and important to understand is those 24 states, for the most part, already were banning the healthcare. Those bans were in effect. Tennessee's ban was in effect, and so people already have lost healthcare in their home state. Families, our lead plaintiff, LW, and her parents, the Williams family, in Tennessee, in 2023, the ban went into effect. They've since that time gone to 4 different states to get access to medical care for their daughter. And that's what's been going on in the majority of the states that have the bans. There's a few that have been blocked in state court, for example. Shout out to Montana, great state constitution. They've been able to get substantial protections for abortion, for gender affirming care, for trans people to access identification. So there are some examples, but for the most part, I think 20 of those bans have been in effect for almost 2 years.
And nobody can contest them now.
And well, yeah, I mean, I think that this will be very difficult to contest the bans for adolescents in those states. I think there's a few where we might be able to, based on the precedents in those circuits. So there's the appeals courts. One of the ways this opinion was narrower was that it did not foreclose certain constitutional arguments about discrimination based on trans status. So in the Fourth Circuit and the Ninth Circuit, there's still good precedent that remains untouched by the decision. So Idaho, West Virginia, South Carolina, North Carolina, there are opportunities to continue litigating against the bans. But mostly, I think we won't see successful challenges in federal court under the federal Constitution, under an equal protection theory. Now, to be clear, the Supreme Court did not address the due process claim. So the claim that these laws violated parents' rights to direct the medical care of their minor children. That was not before them. That is before the lower court, so that, we live to fight another day on that theory. And, as a potential point of a troubling point, but also potential point of optimism, there is a case coming up to the Supreme Court from the state of Montana where the government is arguing that parents have a right to be notified of their children's abortions, and they're making a parental rights argument on the sort of other side of the parental. It's a very conservative argument usually. So the court is going to have to grapple with whether they're going to have a principled approach to parental rights. Given the court, I'm guessing they won't, but it is going to be something that remains in the conversation around these bans.
Something that surprised me, and correct me if I'm wrong about anything, because it's possible, but what really surprised me was it seemed like they were trying to disqualify the whole idea of transgender people. Like they were trying to disqualify it by saying that gender dysphoria was not a medical condition, and it did not warrant the application of the healthcare.
Yeah, I mean, so I wouldn't take it that far. And I think there's lots of reasons to think that is where we're going with this court. But I think, and this is totally minor, but the court says, they make a point in the opinion, majority opinion, to say, we're taught transgender boys are people assigned female at birth who identify as boys, and transgender girls are people assigned male at birth who identify as girls. So they're, honoring the existence of trans people. Unfortunately, the analysis around our healthcare is also part of a long history of this court being terrible when it comes to bodily autonomy. And there's a decision from 1973 called Godoldig, in which the court said that discrimination based on pregnancy is not sex discrimination, even though only people assigned female at birth can get pregnant. They didn't exactly say it that way. But this idea that when it comes to our bodies and the ability of the government to control and regulate and decide what is right for our bodies, the court has long deferred to the state governments and the federal government. So it is discounting of trans experience, but it is not unique to trans experience when it comes to this court's precedents. And so I would not, I think there's lots of reasons to be very concerned about what this court thinks about everything that I personally believe in, but I wouldn't say they're nullifying trans identity, because they especially go so far as to say, we're not going to resolve the question of whether other forms of discrimination against transgender people would be permissible. And the court reaffirms its 2020 decision in Bostock versus Clayton County, Georgia, holding that it is impermissible sex discrimination to discriminate against LGBT people in employment. And not only that, they leave open the question of whether that decision has broader implications outside employment. So those are the sort of high notes of the decision, sort of how much it leaves open. So I'm not ready to say the court has foreclosed trans discrimination claims or, sort of denied trans existence, even though practically speaking, of course, that's what it feels like. And certainly that's what these governments are doing, and that's their objective.
I have a problem talking about this issue with people who are not of like mind. Because people seem to think it's a very complicated situation, and that it doesn't affect them because they don't. A lot of people I know, some people I know, don't understand the trans experience. They see it as a choice and not as something that is inevitable for that person to have to face with themselves. And one of the things that I'm so curious about, just about you personally, and I know you're a lawyer and you're trained in this stuff, but to go up against the Supreme Court, to actually make a case, and knowing that people don't actually share your view on this, where do you have to go inside yourself to be able to do that?
Oh, that's a good, into lots of different compartments. And I think that because I've spent the last 13 years going to state legislatures across the country and lobbying with, the Republican caucuses in Texas and South Dakota and Tennessee, I'm very familiar with conversations around our lives and experience that have no grounding in um, what I think of as reality. Um, and at the same time, there have always been pockets in the most unlikely places where I've been able to connect with people. And I come from, my father's a very conservative person. My brother was in the military. Even within my own family, so many divergent viewpoints. And so I try to bring that sense of possibility into these spaces. And in these legislatures, a lot of times you can connect with people as parents. You can connect with people on values that they share with you. And then, of course, they go and they say the most horrific things. So that just meant when I was going and talking to Clarence Thomas and Justice Alito, and Justice Thomas, I should say. I don't know why I refer to them differently. But it really didn't feel like anything new. The stakes were higher, but this is how this is how judges are. This is how lawmakers are, and it.
Mm.
So I really in the process of preparing to argue before the Supreme Court, I really only had to focus on bringing the legal arguments to the context. It didn't feel like a new emotional battle, because that battle is every day.
And the battle is really about, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, but what we're talking about is 100,000 young people in those 24 states that are being denied the gender affirming health care. That's right? But
Yeah, so 100,000 trans people live in these states, but that's not the number actually being denied care. That I mean, it's a very small. I mean, nationally, I think the estimates are there are 5,000 young adolescents who have received puberty blockers. It's an extraordinarily small number of people who actually receive the care, and we have an outsized idea of how often it is prescribed because of right-wing media narratives. That said, there are over 100,000 trans adolescents in these states that may or may not need access to care that are subjected to these types of laws that are, harming them whether they need care or not, because the rhetoric behind the law is that you are, undeserving of medical care, that your identity is a product of social contagion and not the core of who you are. And so I think there's sort of two things to tease out about the numbers. One is there are 100,000 young people who live in states with these laws, and much smaller numbers of those people actually receive this medical care.
and why do you think that like what do you think is at the core of the objection?
You know, I mean, so I think this is all part of a retrenchment around gender more broadly that we're seeing across the country. I mean, you can see just, whether it's the polling data that's showing you ideas about, what men's and women's roles should be, that the rise of authoritarian governments coincides with retrenchment around gender, control over people's bodies, people's family structures. And that's a part of what we're seeing in the United States and around the world. And then when it comes to trans people, this is a manufactured set of concerns. Media Matters reported very recently that Fox News ran 400 segments on trans athletes in 4 months. That isn't, first of all, there are not 400 trans athletes who are young people in the United States, not even close. So that means that a group of people that in some states there's one, maybe zero, and people who are in this media climate are getting this manufactured sense of an emergency, a crisis. And that has drastically changed the climate. It was not the case 5 years ago that this had the level of resonance that it does now. It's a media manufactured crisis in people's minds, completely contrived. And the purpose of it, I think, is twofold. It's much like what we saw in the early 2000s around marriage equality, the driving people out to vote in elections with this, idea of a changing world, and it's effective. But now the media climate has changed so dramatically. And then I think that there is this fear of not knowing that, M. Gesson had this op-ed in the New York Times this past week in the aftermath of the decision that I really recommend everyone read, because it is sort of this idea that parents are afraid that they don't know their children, that thing, and I think that in the context of the pandemic, that's when you saw this real rise of the backlash around curriculum. And all of a sudden, when kids were home and schools were closer, it sort of showed parents that, wait, what is happening? What is this world? I don't like this changing world. I don't like this idea that I maybe don't know myself and I don't know my child. And I think that's part of it. This anxiety and when people are fearful, they sometimes look to mechanisms of control, and controlling what can be true for people and making our ideas of possibilities smaller is I think, unhealthy way to respond to that. But I think we're an unhealthy society, and that is part of what's going on here.
It's interesting you bring up the pandemic. I had an incredible experience during the pandemic, and a unique one, which is I started the Future Perfect Project maybe 2.5 years before the pandemic started, and we traveled around the United States, going into schools and LGBT centers and offering workshops. We'd stay for a week with young people and work with the queer young people in the high school and really get them to tell their stories, make music with them, really just encourage them to speak their truth, because I was fascinated by what was happening in 2017, in 16, 17, 18. And then the pandemic hit, and we instantly moved everything online, all of our workshops. And suddenly there were hundreds of young people from their bedrooms Zooming in, doing these workshops and changing their names from week to week, their pronouns. And I would say, from my personal experience, it was the most incredible experience of watching a metamorphosis happen. It was like watching butterflies come out of their cocoon. And if there's a contagion that people are, it seems to me that they're afraid of, it's the contagion of happiness. That these young people actually, the freedom to express themselves and to be themselves is a terror, as was my joy as a young queer kid to my parents who did not know what this was. And they knew what it was. They just didn't want it. And I think to myself, we're just in another inflection point for this. And I'm so excited to be able to share what they make, because they're the best advocates for themselves than anybody else could possibly be. But what I find is that people diminish their happiness, and that they diminish their agency, and they diminish the things that they have to say by saying, "Well, it could change." And I'm like, the irony is they changed me.
Yeah.
They changed I changed my name, I changed my pronouns. I was like, wait, I thought I was a gay man for like my whole life. And I was like, I never felt that. I mean, I enjoyed the sex, but I realized I was non-binary, and they encouraged me. And I think partly why adults are afraid is that they're going to have to change as well,
Yeah.
right? That they're going to have to ask themselves some serious questions about their own identity.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I always say is this fear of transness is the fear that people have of freedom. There is something that
Mm.
constraint is comforting. If there's only two binary set paths, it's the same reason why queerness makes people afraid. It's that I am supposed to, there's a men and women and we're attracted to each other and that's all that's available. If you expand that, then people do have to ask questions of themselves, and they have to be confronted with people who are at a very young age wholly comfortable with this idea that
Mm.
the world is bigger and more, there are more possibilities. And I think that is really scary for people, and they want to shut it down. And one of my colleagues often says that, the right hates gender affirming care, not because they think it doesn't work, but because they know it does. And they don't want people to live these embodied, full lives. And they don't like the idea that there could be trans people just running around, that they wouldn't be able to identify based on their own ideas of what transness is. And that's what they want to stop. They
And
want
do
to
you think
stop.
that the bans against gender affirming healthcare are really a way to be able that people are forced to reveal their transness?
I think it's a combination. I mean, I think it's a force to reveal their transness, and I think it's to just simply, make it harder for people to survive. And, I don't think it's hyperbolic to say so, because we know that this care is a lifeline. It allows so many people to thrive. And if you think about what it means, it's different, say, for my generation and older, when we didn't have access to it and then we got it. I mean, they're ripping it away from people who had it, which I think is even more dangerous because
And cruel.
and cruel, and they know it's cruel, and you can see that it's cruel because this decision came down the same day that the Trump administration shut down the hotline for LGBTQ youth. It's a systematic, across the board way to use every branch of government to limit survival opportunities. And the LGBT community is not the only community that's experienced this in this history. I mean, it's been done to Indigenous people and Black people and immigrants. I mean, look at what we're doing right now. We're diminishing survival opportunities for people by fear and by cutting off resources.
But people I find are really under educated about the protocol. They don't really understand it. They don't understand the steps that have been worked out to be able to allow this on ramping of to become trans.
Yeah, they don't understand, but it's also the case that it's like, I mean, you don't understand anyone's medical care protocol. You don't, it's not like you're like sitting there being like, oh, like, are those parents really looking into the, pre-diabetic use of Ozempic for like, people aren't, this is a man, we actually don't pay attention to other people's medical care. And why should we? In the same way, it's like, why do you care about someone else's marriage? Like, just, it doesn't concern you. And so, I think one of the ways that outsized fixation on a group of people operates is that it's so out of the bounds of
Mm.
how we actually exist in the world. Like the idea that you could even rush in the United States access to medical care that requires a specialist. You have to stop knowing everything you know about healthcare in the United States. Like that's a ridiculous proposition. I mean, in New York City, if you want to see a specialist for your child, they're like, oh, in 2027, we have an appointment. And that's the same for this care. And so it's deliberately distorted, and people are deliberately like letting go of their critical faculties to make these arguments. But it is true, of course, they are also being told by a media machine that kids are being rushed into care and there's no oversight, and they're getting hormones at the pharmacy without their parents. And that, of course, is not true. It's also true that we just have no idea how anyone else's medical care works, generally speaking.
Speaking of the media, um, why I we almost talked about this last night, and I was like, we can't talk about this. We have to talk about this tomorrow. I I'm disappointed, fascinated, outraged by the stance of the New York Times and their coverage of trans lives. It's just out of step with what we know, and it's based on all sorts of faulty information.
Yeah, it is. And I too am very frustrated. It's also the case that the New York Times was terrible in covering AIDS, and terrible in covering marriage equality, is terrible in covering the immigration raids right now. It's a institution that is obsessed with showing its own of I don't know what. It's sort of appealing to the idea of a both sides approach to journalism that
But they don't seem they're
yes, but they don't. But so and then the
they
way
haven't
they
asked you to
do it.
write a have they asked you to write an op-ed?
I know, but I have written twice. I think it's more that collectively they're like they say we'll do this type of trans coverage to balance out the rest of the things that we're accused of being too far to the left. I mean, I think it's absolutely terrible. I think their coverage has contributed more to the anti-trans laws than almost any other thing in this country. It's, Justice Thomas's concurrence cited to the New York Times, I think 10 times. It's very, very often that the briefs of the state governments reference the New York Times articles, which is in and of itself a bizarre thing to do. We have evidence in these cases. We have factual records. We have doctors putting in testimony in cases where we've gone to trial, where there's a fact finding, which is the way law is supposed to work. They'd still go to the New York Times. It's this idea that this is an expert's source, when it's very much an ideological source, and it's providing a skewed view, particularly of healthcare for trans people. But the coverage goes back, for decades, and sort of this anti-queer orientation, and this idea that they can situate us as people to be debated. And that has been true for a long time. I think when it comes to the trans coverage, it's so insidious, and the challenges that so many people don't have any counter narrative, don't have other sources of information, and that's why they get caught up in this. Well, I mean, are there kids getting healthcare too soon? Are my daughter plays sports, and so these questions have been planted in people's minds for a reason, to sow this sense that there's a problem, and a problem to be solved, and the solution they're providing is legitimizing anti-trans laws.
And where do you think people should turn to for more accurate information?
I mean, I think that's a hard question, because I think we need to sort of curate our own information on different
Yeah.
topics and sort of find the sources that we trust and rely on. And I don't have a good answer to where you should get all of your news from. What do you think? Do you have one?
Democracy Now!
Democracy Now!
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's very helpful. Um, the really Instagram is very helpful in terms of hearing from people directly, like you, like following people like you, and hearing from you directly.
Yeah, I think finding the people that you really trust is so important.
Yeah,
And, I mean, I think
and
the organizations that provide information on their social media pages as well.
I asked this young person that we worked with. They're now when I first met June, She was 18 years old, and she was in a workshop, and she said the most beautiful thing, and I think maybe I'm going to quote her if I can,
Yes, please do.
because it just, since, if I can, if you give me 1 second. Talk amongst yourselves.
Well, you want to ask me a quick question, or I can talk about something while you look?
Yeah, I'm interested in this. It sort of feeds into this question, which is, you're. I read this thing that you said that we have to reinvent what success looks like in this movement right now, and I was wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, if so one of the things that in my mind happened between 2011 and 2015 as we started to have a lot of legal successes from, striking down the Defense of Marriage Act to winning Obergefell, having state level wins on behalf of LGBT people, but also LGBT people, as we got intoxicated by the idea of victory in the courts. And the problem with victory in the courts is that it is just necessarily limited. And if you look at 1954, the court decides Brown v. Board of Education, and you look at 2025, and we have a problem with segregation, racial segregation in schools. And they just use different ways to do it. Housing policies, they use class lines, and the problem was an over reliance on law. And I think then if you look at something like Roe v. Wade, same thing. It's a huge success in the courts with decades of backlash. And so victory isn't always going to be a court victory, especially a Supreme Court victory. And if we look at Bowers v. Hardwick in 1986, it was a loss, a categorical, devastating loss. The Supreme Court says that states can criminalize same-sex intimacy, sets back legal advocacy for decades until the court overturns it in 2003 with Lawrence. But within that moment, there were lots of victories. The ACLU's LGBT project was founded within months of Bowers v. Hardwick. We started to win local cases on behalf of individuals to make sure they weren't evicted from their housing. And there are victories every day where people, stop a community member from being deported, where you show up and help someone move from one state to another to get health care. And no, we shouldn't have to only rely on each other. I believe that the government should take care of us, but we have the capacity to make our own successful interventions in this moment. And when we lose a case and we don't lose it as badly as we might have, then that too is a victory. That too leaves us avenues to keep fighting. And there's all sorts of examples of that. And there's all sorts of wins we're having in the lower courts right now on a range of issues in litigation against Trump that seemingly were foreclosed by other terrible Supreme Court precedent, whether it was the immunity decision or the affirmative action decision or Dobbs. All of these catastrophic losses have made way for other gains, have left open other possibilities. And so that is success. There's not just one form of winning. And if we get intoxicated by what seems like a transformational win and don't do the work to stabilize it and build up the infrastructure, then ultimately we're just going to be subjected to a backlash that we're not prepared for.
I was at an event where Kevin Jennings was talking, and I was amazed when he gave me he gave everybody the numbers of the cases from just last year that they've won. That together, all of you all work together. I understand.
Yes, we do.
And that was also a surprise that the ACLU and Lambda Legal and other organizations, you have these meetings where you decide, okay, you take this case, you take this case. But I was surprised that so many of them were won.
Yeah, we won. I mean, we've won so many cases. We've lost cases. We continue to win cases against the Trump administration. And I think one thing that is so important is, you know, Scrimetti is a horrible decision and it makes no sense. And also, it is not going to foreclose the litigation we have against the Trump administration. Much of it is grounded in different legal theories altogether. And a lot of it is based on the president's violation of the separation of powers, exceeding his constitutional authority to infringe upon the role of Congress and other theories. So that will all continue. And every time we stop something, even for a short period of time, even if it's ultimately overturned, 4 months where someone gets healthcare that they wouldn't have otherwise been able to get is a win. I really firmly believe that, because the work of law is always harm reduction work. And so if you reduce those harms, that is successful in my view.
Okay, I found my quote. So June Buck is a young person that I met in a workshop and is now trans. And I asked her recently what she thought about what was happening. And this is what she wrote me. The U.S. government cannot be the authority on what's real and what's not. You create your realness in your relationship with yourself and the people who see you and love you. The government didn't think Marsha P. Johnson was Marsha P. Johnson, but she did, and her friends did. And we do the same today, decades after her passing. That's where her realness comes from. We will keep each other real.
Mm.
Isn't that amazing?
That's amazing. I mean, like,
and just to give another example, I was in January, the week of the inauguration. Is that what it's called? Yeah. They're still calling it that. And
coronation is coming.
yeah, they're going to change it. And there was a 15-year-old boy. His name is Lance, and it was so moving to me because he was just months away from starting his hormone replacement therapy, and he was 15 years old, and he knew that was probably not going to happen, and it was going to change the trajectory of his life. And we were interviewing him for this podcast that we have called I'm Feeling Queer Today. And we asked him, well, do you have any message for other LGBTQ plus young people? And he said, yeah, how do I say this? Anything you can think to be or any identity you can adopt for yourself, it's probably been done before. And I'm not telling you that so that you don't feel special. I'm telling it to you so that you don't feel alone. And you'd be smart to look to your elders and study your queer history to learn how our ancestors adapted to the circumstances that are worse than the ones that we are living through. And I thought, this is why they're so afraid of it.
Yeah, they're so powerful.
And in that moment, to really still have that sense, and I think it's the thing that really shocked me so much about these young people is their ability to understand the timeline. They're the first generation to really come of age with an awareness that people have made sacrifices, that people have fought for their rights. And they also have a sense that people are coming after them, and they have a responsibility to those young people in second and third grade to model for them what it looks like to be a trans person or a non-binary person or just queer.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why it's so insidious that they've adopted this social contagion frame, because what it does is it encourages isolation. It suggests that the mere process of identifying yourself with your peers is somehow an indication of your deviance and lack of realness. That they'll say, oh, well, a lot of trans people have trans friends. I'm like, yes. That's not like, this seems like a logical way to live your life, as I basically don't associate with straight people. No offense. But so it's that the formation of peer groups is being weaponized against people. And it's the same way trans women of color on the street, when they congregated together, were arrested for loitering, for sex work. And so the way the state turns against people to keep us from forming our communities, we have to be so vigilant to that practice, because it is incredible that people are finding each other. That is so beautiful, especially for those of us that were so isolated as young people. And they're using it so consistently to justify the discrimination. And that's one of the things I want to fight back against so aggressively, because I can't even believe we've legitimized this idea that people are becoming trans. And that's evidenced through a contagion, which is evidenced by the fact that they locate peer groups online and in person, when that is just the most obvious, smart thing to do.
Yeah. It's been their salvation,
Yeah,
each other.
each other.